social media stuff, should we set up an Omnibor Mastodon server?
Do we want to run our own server? I don't actually have an opinion. I just have a question.
So the way that institutions have been proving ownership and sort of self-verifying is run a micro instance just for broadcast at their same domain.
I am certainly in favor of experimenting with that. It does sound like a fun adventure.
It is relatively easy once we have the omnibor.io website, migration, to then run an omnibor.io Mastodon instance that has exactly, 1 or 2 user accounts on it and no more. It's just there as a broadcast.
Okay,
And
that's cool.
That way DNS provides the verification.
Well, one thing I do want to point out is that from a DNS point of view, we do actually have the Omnibor domain names. So if if the gating issue is getting a subdomain of Omnibor so that whoever's going to go and kick the tires on the Mastodon stuff can go play with it, that's something that can be solved pretty much now.
I think the gating issue is order of operations. Sort of should we, was a question. I jumped right to how to. And then after the website migration, I guess it doesn't make as much sense to stand up the Masto broadcast until people know that the migration's happened.
No, that's fine. I tend to be something of a parallel processor in these regards, especially for newer things, because my experience has been it's not so much a question of something can go wrong, it will go wrong. It will be the thing that never occurred to you that can go wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I tend to think in terms of path exploration. So if anybody is interested in the path exploration side of this at this time, I think the mechanics can proceed if we decide we want the mechanics to proceed now, is my point.
David, were you putting your hand up to do that?
I was putting my hand up to say, give me a week and I will have a mechanism for standing up as many Mastodon servers as we want.
I would, it's suggested instead you and I spend 5 minutes to chat about it, since I've run a Mastodon instance since 2017.
I would love to chat about that. So should I drop you a meeting invite or something?
Great. I think even just 5 minutes after this call is going to work for me.
Unfortunately, I have to get in my car and drive to a meeting just after this call. In fact, probably 10 minutes before it ends. But I'll
a meeting invite will do.
Okay, to your Microsoft address?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
All right. Any updates on upcoming events and conferences?
We did not get something into FOSDEM's SBOM track. There are other tracks that still have open CFPs, and as noted here, Usenix.
Yeah, do we have anyone who's going to FOSDEM or thinks they're going to FOSDEM or might want to go to FOSDEM or lives near Brussels?
This might speak a little bit also to our time zone discussion from several months back. We are currently a very US time zone centric meeting series. I will not be going to FOSDEM this year, I don't think.
It's too close to a big Rust conference for me to go to it.
Yeah. For me, among other things, it's too close to the Cloud Native Security Con in Seattle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and I find travel excessively stressful to begin with, and so just like going to a conference in Seattle and immediately hopping a plane to Europe was just overwhelming.
Yeah, that is also my challenge, and I have never gone to FOSDEM and not come home sick, and that was before the pandemic. The unique structure of that conference when in person leads to everyone getting concred.
Yeah, it is sort of the epitome of the super spreader event.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is that you're spreading.
Yeah.
Including ideas and memes, by the way.
Absolutely. It's a great place to spread those. But
The symptoms of those are typical. Well, okay, I take that back. Some ideas have terrible symptoms.
Some memes too.
Yes, true.
Okay, so any other conferences to update on?
That said, I would actually suggest that if folks are interested, I haven't yet combed through. Chris gave us a bunch of places to go look for upcoming conferences. I haven't really combed through those. If folks are interested in combing through and putting together a list of bogeys and adding to the agenda, that would be super welcome.
Cool. All right. Any updates on this request for feedback on blog post? I know that we don't have Chris here today. These are all looking from August, September. So shall we hold off on this until a time when Chris is at the meeting?
Yeah, either Chris or I have done some updates on it. I think it's sitting on both of our backlogs among things.
Gotcha. All right, reviewing from previous meetings. I don't think Andrew is here this week, so we will wait on that unless anyone else knows any update around this.
Nope, I don't know.
All right. Okay, so let's going back to rule of two. This kind of ties into what we have down here, distinguishing between artifact IDs and GitBOM docs. Ed, do you want to share a screen to go through these?
Yeah, let me go ahead and do that. And we'll sort of walk through where we stand. The good news is we're almost, I think we're very, very close to being done with this. And I think we're actually relatively close to being able to issue a spec, but we'll talk about that as we go. Let me go ahead and share. Can everyone see the share, and is it at a size that's useful?
Could you bump up the text just a little bit?
Is that better?
That is, yep.
Excellent. Thank you for raising that. So I think the only thing we have left on the rule of two stuff itself is the PR for the FS persistence. And that very well may be pretty close to merging. And then after, in terms of the rule of two pieces, and then, so shall we take a look at that now? See what folks think?
Sounds good.
Okay. So we did have this outstanding discussion, Ava, between you and I about the paths.
Mm-hmm.
And just to bring this back in context, basically, I was in favor of precision because that basically means that you know exactly what you're talking about. And you had been concerned about the length of the path growing at this point. Do you want to say a little bit more about your thoughts on this?
Primarily that the first part of the path.adg implies gitoid. And that is an assumption. It's an assumption on my part that we won't have a different type of identifier down the road.
It's okay. I mean, effectively, it's a question of simplicity versus future proofing. My tendency is, even though I lean towards gitoids, is, for example, if you look at Git came out of nowhere. I mean, not strictly out of nowhere if you get into the deep history, but for most people's consciousness, came out of nowhere and took the world by storm unexpectedly. And so I don't want to preclude the fact that something does something similar to Git in the future. As a matter of personal opinion, I expect Git will be with us for a very long time. I actually think Git's likely to be more durable than Linux personally over time. But I don't want to put us into a hole where the world gets confusing or imprecise.
Yeah, so here's I see your point, but here's my argument nonetheless. Down here, bottom of the screen right now, where you argue that gitoid : blob : SHA-1 is different than SHA-1. Completely agree. In the context of where that referent is scoped, gitoid has semantic value.
What you're saying is the gitoid is implicit to the objects directory.
Yes. We have, right, in the .adg/object/gitoid, gitoid there is duplicating information from higher level directory structure, whereas /blob/SHA-1, those two identifiers have semantic value. The /gitoid word has no semantic value in that sentence.
Okay. So my question would be, do other folks have thoughts or opinions here?
I'm good with either.
Okay, so one thing also that occurs to me here is, trying to think. So basically, one of the other things that occurs to me here is, I know that we have people in the community who are looking to use different. Two things occur to me. One is, I think that we have people who are looking to use different SHA types, and essentially what you're saying is have them use some other namespace under objects. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, we have hash flexibility here. Someone can use a different type of SHA function.
Right. But like, for example, we've got folks who'd like to use Blake as an identifier in internal builds, for example.
Sure. So what would be ineffective about them using .adg/objects/blob/Blake? Why does that not work?
Or just /Blake. Okay. No. I see your point there.
Right. Blake is the hash function. So ADG objects Blake blob Blake is duplicative. ADG objects my company blob Blake is namespacing the hash function into the company and thereby preventing other users of the Blake hash function from seeing it as relevant to them. I think that's distracting. I mean, if Microsoft were to use a different hash function, we've had a discussion with some of our friends at Facebook or other companies who are here saying, yeah, internally we use a different hash function. Totally fine with that. Obviously, we need to support that. We have that support in the hash.
One of the other things that occurs to me is that in terms of forward compatibility, if suddenly everyone moves from Git to GOT in the future, we could simply introduce a GOT namespace at the top level and proceed from there.
So I hear that, and I don't think that's an argument we need to address today, because we've assumed at the top level .adg this exists within that environment, right? If you are using Git, you can put .adg in your Git tree. If you're using GOT, you could put the same tree structure that we have here in your GOT top level directory. You don't need to scope it inside this, or am I wrong?
Okay, so I think you didn't quite get my point, and then I think there's a mistaken bit in the statement that you just made.
Okay, great.
So please don't take this as arguing, either of these is arguing against your point per se. So the .adg directory probably won't live in your Git repo at all. Probably won't. It'll probably be dumped off somewhere to the side where it can be farmed in order to retrieve that information for what folks are doing. So we can't presume that .adg is living in a Git repo, right? Which I think you just suggested.
I am suggesting that in many cases it would.
Okay, so I don't think we can presume that it will, right? And so I don't think we can presume context from that. Now, it is fair to say, and the point that I was making, it is fair to say that we are going to contextually presume that we're going to start with things being gitoids, and so the things we need to distinguish are blob SHA-1, and thus suppress the gitoid. The point that I had been making was a point about clear forward path to future proofing, which is to say that if it turns out that we do actually get a successor to Git, the apocryphal GOT, in a time frame that matters to us, then we could simply correct for that by introducing a top-level GOToid directory to disambiguate it in much the same way you're talking about my namespace here.
Oh, okay. So I see your point. Thank you for the clarification.
My point was that
if
there was
we,
clear visibility to how to actually get where you want to go.
In a scenario where we are supporting GOT, either in addition to or in replacement of Git, that would be a potentially completely different naming scheme, and blob SHA-1 /2 letters / remainder of hash ID, all of that might be different because all of that is Git semantics. So everything after GOT ID might be a completely different structure than what we have today.
But more importantly, I could support GOT IDs by simply saying put them under a GOT ID subdirectory.
And everything after that might be a completely different structure.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, now I see your point. It's not, it is to support a completely different hypothetical data structure after that separator.
Well, and the confusion was that I was insufficiently clear about the fact that I was exploring the idea space rather than advocating a particular position.
Yeah, I see the value in that now.
I don't think it necessarily goes into the spec. This is an architectural white space matter in my own head, in that when specifying things, you want to keep your specs as simple as you can, but thinking a little bit about the future prevents you from painting yourself into a corner later.
Yeah, this would, if we ever wanted to support a completely different data structure for GOT instead of Git, we would need to have something like this, and making it backward compatible without this would be difficult. So, okay, my objection is addressed.
So I like the conversation. I like where it's gone, but let me throw a future thinking into Ed's head. A lot of what we've been doing around normalizing the directory structure is making it easy for tools.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with future proofing. On the other hand, we wind up adopting a structure, a directory structure that is different based on namespacing, where our only namespace right now is gitoid. Is that going to then violate our tooling, our simple for tooling mandate? And you know, I get that if we use GOT might have a different way of kind of expressing its entities in directory structure. Do we have to actually mirror that? In other words, is our hashing system, our approach really tied to the directory structure? Or can we say, look, the directory structure is something that's immutable going forward, even if there's a different source control system and or hashing system?
Well, and so basically my thinking had been with the original proposal was this, which was whatever hashing scheme you're using, it's relatively easy to construct a hashing scheme URI, right? People have done it for lots of hashing schemes. We have one for gitoid. If you have a hashing scheme URI, you can translate that URI to something that lets you know which hashing scheme you're talking about, because you do need to be able to tell which hashing scheme you're talking about. And the sort of most algorithmic translation in my mind was take the URI for the hashing scheme, because we discuss things in terms of that internal to the document. And if you have characters like colons that you really, really shouldn't use in path segments, then translate them to slashes, right? And that's a very clear heuristic that is extensible and that doesn't have cases to it, if that makes sense. right? We aren't describing different cases. I think that's getting to your point about tool folks. Is we don't specify special cases. We just simply say have URI. This is how you translate URI to the directory structure. I don't care what the URI is. That's your problem, right?
Mhm.
And so I think you're basically saying that the slightly more complicated version may actually be simpler for tool providers. Is that correct?
What I'm saying is having the concept of different directory structures based on namespace is rubbing me suboptimally. And I think what you just said actually reinforces my argument, which is our directory structure reflects the URI structure that we've chosen. Until we choose a URI structure, we shouldn't choose a different directory structure, and therefore removing gitoid altogether from the directory stuff would make sense, but leaving it in also doesn't bother me. But I wouldn't look at it as an extensibility thing. I would look at extensibility purely through the lens of the URI itself, with a non-extensible structure for translating URI to directory structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's on point, or am I kind of going off into space here?
I think it's on point. I think it's on point. What do other folks think? So I think, Ava, you had come to some resolution in your own mind, but it wasn't entirely clear to me what that resolution was.
Apologies, I had to sneeze.
Oh, apologies. Bless you.
I may have missed a little bit of that. Sorry.
The question I was asking was, it sounded as if you had come to a conclusion in your own mind, but I had not quite constructed in my mind what that conclusion was.
Yeah.
Could you restate it?
I'm happy to. I can conceive of a situation where having the namespace as the third field in the path structure provides some future-proof value. I think it massively complicates tooling to support that scenario. I think that was David's point, that fixing our directory structure based on the directory structure that we inherit from Git today is a valuable proposition to keep our tooling simple. Your proposition, Ed, is a valuable one to future-proof for a hypothetical future that we are nowhere near, as far as I'm aware. I can see value in both of those. My personal preference is keep it simple, because that will ease development and adoption. But I cannot argue against future-proofing where the kind of change to make this compatible, should we need to replace the third field, gitoid, would be very disruptive. I don't think we will, but it is a valid concern. I'm still on the side of I'd rather keep it simple and remove the third field.
Do any of the tool authors on the call have opinions? Since a lot of this, I think, hinges on keeping things simple for tool authors.
Now, if I may put a very fine point on that, Nell, can you walk us through imagining in some of the tooling you've been building, what would happen if the tooling needed to support not just replacing the phrase gitoid, the third field, but actually completely restructuring the data structure after that?
It would add overhead, and it would make the code more complicated. It's not insurmountable, but yes, it would add complexity.
Would we need to, for example, add some sort of dynamic or API sort of support to allow a plugin if some downstream user said, hey, I need to support my private namespace, which has a different data structure underneath that entirely, not just a different hash function swapping, but an entire different data structure. programming for that kind of dynamic interface to a file system is a fair chunk of work.
It is. It is.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the
I'm
thought
almost
that-
having flashbacks to Redfish spec, which was a meta spec ultimately, because that's what. Yeah.
So one thing that occurs to me here is in my personal proxy for complexity here basically is, if you look at the current spec as written, we talk about the identifier type, right? The artifact identifier type. And that is specified as a URI. And we basically go through and we specify that there are two such URIs that you need to support, the blob SHA-1 and the blob SHA-256. Now, and the current specification here simply says, take whatever your URI is and replace any colons with slashes and go forth on your way. In rewriting the spec, if I eliminate the gitoid, then I have to go through and say, take whatever the URI is for your artifact identifier. If it is a gitoid, remove the gitoid prefix and then replace whatever with colons. If it is not a gitoid, then either we have to figure out a different set of definitions, or we have to leave undefined what to do if something is not a gitoid. And so one of the things as a proxy in my mind is that effectively, when I conceptualize this in code, when you look at the spec that way, now we've gone from one case, which is take your URI prefix and do a simple replacement, to a couple of different cases. And the logic in the spec often in my mind translates to logic in code.
I think you are arguing now in favor of my position, Ed.
I don't think so, but tell me what you think you're hearing from me.
I think I'm hearing from you that if in reading the path structure, you see gitoid, then you know how to parse the colons into slashes into colons.
Yes.
What you're not saying is, if you see something that is not gitoid, then you have to follow a completely different logic branch in the code and the spec. And what I'm saying is, assume gitoid and do these things, which makes it even simpler than what you're proposing. And right now, I am leaning on the side of keep this as simple as possible so that the project can have velocity, make some assumptions. The right amount is always the tricky bit, but we should make some assumptions, and pinning our tooling on the use of gitoid, assuming things are gitoid, to me is a valuable assumption today.
So, not to argue any of what you just said about your perception of the simplicity of this, but the point I was making was actually the opposite. The point I was making is, if you look at how removing gitoid translates
5 more
into
minutes
the writing,
on this topic, I think. Sorry about that.
Thank you. If you look at what removing gitoid does to the complexity of the spec, it increases the complexity of the spec. And by increasing the complexity, oh yes, because now instead of simply saying, take whatever your artifact ID URI is and replace any colons with slashes, which is very simple to state, I have to say, take whatever your artifact type URI is. If it is a gitoid, so gitoid is now a special case in the spec, then strip the gitoid colon out of it and replace any colons with slashes. And because here's the thing I think that's not clear. Here's the thing I think, let me finish my thought. So, and then if it is not a gitoid, you have an entire branch. So we've gone from one case, translate your identifier type to a chunk of directory structure algorithmically. That's the one case currently proposed. If we drop the gitoid, we now have made gitoid a special case, and everything else has to be generalized in some other way. Now, here's one thing I think that I may not have been clear about, and I think this may be the source of the problem. You talked about having different structure under it. Gitoid blob SHA-1 is a single field here. It's your URI identifier. And since any hash, any identifier should be expressible, that's expressible as sort of a binary hash, should be expressible as an artifact identifier type followed by some sequence of hex digits.
Oh,
you don't actually get different structures here.
This
Does that make sense?
I think I see the problem now, and it's at a different level than I was debating. Encoding in the spec a means of transforming the directory structure to say ADG objects is directory structure, gitoid blob SHA-1 is identifier, and then 0e/8e is again a different identifier. That is too much detail in some ways for the spec. Now I see your concern. Like this gets into, but it's because the spec is defining the parsing behavior.
Well, effectively, the spec is defining. The spec is defining. We have to persist in some fashion the type of the identifier, right? And we have to persist in the value of the identifier. For hexadecimal things, the value of the identifier, this is pretty generalizable for the value.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is to have something that is generalizable for the type as well.
I see.
Without having to dictate special cases, which means special case logic. Does that make sense?
It does. Now that I'm rereading this part of the spec, not the commentary, but the actual spec, my argument earlier doesn't map to the current spec. There's an assumption here that the entire directory structure is fixed, where the artifact identifier type URI prefix.
Yep.
Scroll up.
Let me actually go to the actual file.
Yeah, go to the file, and I think we can see what we're pointing at, and hopefully wrap this up in 1 minute.
Okay.
Right there. No, up, yep. Right there.
Yep.
Line 19.
Yep.
Right. So this is asserting that artifact identifier type URI prefix with colon replaced by a slash. That field, you want to future-proof because there might be a different artifact identifier type URI prefix with colon replaced by a slash, and the rest must be unchanged. I'm assuming that if the artifact identifier type changes, the remainder of the directory structure changes potentially as well, because that's how artifact identifiers work. So I think there's a flaw in this line in the logic implied by asserting the directory structure is constant while artifact identifier type is mutable.
There is an implicit assumption in this line, and the implicit assumption is the artifact identifier will be effectively representable as a hex string.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's to respect Nell's time check. We have rattled on this sufficiently, I think. I will now go make some suggestions on this line to tease out that assumption.
Okay, that's fine. Cool.
Sounds good. All right. Was there anything else on this that you wanted to discuss, Ed?
I think really quickly, in looking at the other comments here, I think on the other comments, so basically on the FS operation stuff, a lot of this I think is getting down into a granularity of requirements for a tool that we don't necessarily have to specify at the level of the API, although I'm open to discussion there, but we don't have Jeremy here today. And then, I think I've addressed some of the other comments that Jeremy provided here. And then Young Kui on the SimFarm idea had various comments, and he went down the line of being concerned about race conditions, but I think we're fine on race conditions. Does that make sense to you, Young Kui?
Yeah, it makes sense. We should be outside.
And then there was a call for examples with metadata that unfortunately I have not filled in this time. There is Jeff had suggested renaming A2G to artifact. We don't have Jeff Shoot here today. My tendency would be to say that this isn't actually, the contents here aren't actually artifacts, they're a mapping. And so while A2G may be too sparse, I don't think artifact would be the right replacement. I did fix this comment where it sounded like build tools were writing specifications that had been made. So I think that's been fixed from Jeremy's comment. So I think the only outstanding arguments here are the to gitoid or not to gitoid discussion. that Ava's following up on. And then I think the other point about renaming the directory could be handled as a separate issue or PR for discussion. So I think if we can resolve the discussion between us, Ava, that I think we can basically get this merged after that and then proceed from there. Does that sound right?
I think so.
Cool.
All right. And then we've got to embed or not to embed. That is the question.
So I think this was Young Kui's, this started off as Young Kui's discussion of record hash mode. And I think basically what I had suggested towards the end here was, if we've got something like the A to G link farm, what you're really talking about is specifying whether or not you should embed. And I had made a suggestion here of a GitBOM, or when we get there, Omnibor do not embed environment variable, which if set and not empty instructs the build tool to not embed GitBOM document, embed GitBOM docs, or the identifier for GitBOM docs and output artifacts. Does that seem reasonable to you, Young Kui, for the purposes that you're looking for?
Yes. So yeah, I'm busy with the other things, and for this one, it will be a lot of big code change. It will take some time for me to use this new suggestion. So yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay.
For me, yeah,
Cool.
I think this one is the most important one. Others are optional. Probably, yeah, no need to even. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's complicated code, although some maybe I think it did that feature, but maybe it's anyway. Yeah, it's it's a bit very hard to get into upstream if we have too much.
Yeah, I agree. Barathi, do
yeah.
you think that this is something that is sufficiently simple that we could get upstream in the compilers to include it as well, or to accept it as well?
I think I don't see a problem with that, but I think we just have to mention that if we are not embedding, then we have to generate data in the form of metadata or elsewhere so that it can be constructed, right? I think that part should also go hand in hand.
So I think that had been the idea behind the A to G link farms, because
is that all? Okay.
The idea being that I think the point you're getting to is you need to be able to go and figure out, having built an artifact, or if you've got an artifact, you need to be able to pick up the artifact and say, is there a GitBOM for this artifact, right?
Okay.
And that's what hopefully the A to G link farm was doing.
Yeah, I think it should be okay. I didn't quite understand why Yonki feels that it's difficult to upstream, but
I think
the idea is important.
It means if you have too much feature, because for my record mode, I have a few attributes there, not just one.
So yeah, Young Kui has a ton of knobs that he had mentioned in the GitBOM build mode, like a bazillion knobs, and that's awesome and excellent. But you want to limit the number of knobs you're imposing in the spec, as I think Young Kui's point.
Okay. Yeah, but I think the knobs in LLVM are much lesser at this point. So
Yep. The one thing I do want to bring up, though, is that the not embedding case opens up the possibility for multiple GitBOM docs for the same artifact ID, which means that we can't have a link farm that is one-to-one if we're going to support a not embedding case. Now, this can be solved by constructing the link farm by replacing the symlink with a directory of symlinks, pointing to the GitBOM documents that in the not embedding case build this artifact. It does open the question then of which one to choose if you're the build tool, because you can't a priori know which of them is right. This is one of the drawbacks of the non-embedding case. But I think for consumption, your best heuristic is something simple like last modified. Simply saying, look, well, if we're actively building right now, then it's probably true that whoever built for us was building just before us, And so the last modified version is probably the one we're looking for. It's not perfect, but it's as good as you can get in the non-embedding case. Does that make sense to folks? Do folks have thoughts?
Makes sense. Does this resolve this open issue?
I think it will resolve this open issue once there's a PR built on top of the PR built on top of the FSPR that brings this in.
Understood.
So,
Yeah,
and I think good.
Yeah, if you want to see, the BOM has implemented this symlink, this A2G link farm. So if you want to give it a try, see how it feels. Yeah, you can give it a try with BOM. It will automatically generate the symlink.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Fixing name changes to Omnivor. Is that supposed to be Omnibor?
Yes.
That might be an autocorrect thing.
Yeah, autocorrect is going to be fun for a while. Yeah, so basically I was trying to list out what we have to do to actually get the initial spec out the door. Resolving the PR for FS persistence, I think, is one thing. Resolving the embed to not embed, and I think we have a clear road ahead for that. It's just a matter of getting the PR in. And then we have to do a pass over the spec to do name fixes to Omnibor. And then I think overall review for sanity. It is not always true that documents written piecewise make any damn sense when you read them as a whole. So obviously we're going to have to go do that review. And then I think you'd add, Ava, you'd like to see POC in 2 or more domains.
Yeah, I don't know that that's a complete blocker before moving forward with the spec, but I do want to see this. I believe we will learn unknowns. Much like as we developed the POCs that we have today, we learned a lot. These two situations are vastly different than compiled languages, and we may have unknown unknowns that we won't discover until we start trying to build integration in a dynamic language and in a package structure, a package format.
So I completely agree with that. I would say that what this calls out to my mind, though, is that we basically have 2 steps. One is getting an initial spec that we think is good enough to point tool authors to. Because one of the things that the tech side of our community has been super patient about is the fact that the spec is moving a bit, right? Everybody's been super patient with that, and that's appreciated. I don't expect everyone to be that patient. And so having something where it's like, we think this is probably the spec is sort of step 1. And then step 2 is getting it to an SDO.
Yeah, and I don't want to point Python, for example, at our spec until we can say with some legs, we think the spec works for Python. I think we have to say to the Python folks, we'd like your help validating our current draft rather than go build it in your tools.
Yep.
Now, the question in my mind is, should we move it to an SDO to gain the visibility and momentum to bring Python, Java, RPM, OCI, whomever into the field to get that POC done? Like, do we move it to the SDO to get the visibility to start the POCs, or do we start the POCs and then move it to the SDO?
Point of clarification, SDO equals Standards Development Organization.
Correct.
Cool.
Yeah, effectively, we do have the means to actually get this up through ISO. And so the real question is, when do we pull the trigger on that? I will say it's actually somewhat easier to get folks involved if you can go point to an ISO spec.
If you can point to a completed ISO spec, at that point, it'll be much easier to get tool developers to start adding support. Completely agree. At the point where it is merely a draft ISO spec, and it may take some time to move through that standards development process, build consensus. There's a lot of value there. We may have enough at this point to start that process. Or once we've done the 2 things above on the screen, we may have enough to start the process in ISO and say, look, we need these things, people from these communities to join that process to continue maturing it before we're ready to say stamp version 1 done. That's also quite possible.
The other thing I would point out is, I believe is written, and again, this is part of the review of the spec. The spec itself is generic enough that there is space for individual language communities to figure out what that looks like for them. So for example, while we do specify what to do for ELF things in terms of embedding, we don't specify what to do for non-ELF things, right?
Sure. And Python will have a PEP. If Python adopts it, they'll go through their own process with a PEP that cites an ISO spec, for example, as the reason they're implementing the PEP.
Absolutely. And what it is that makes sense for them in terms of how they want to implement it. As I think I've said a couple times, my steep suspicion is we will find ___ ADG __ somewhere.
Sure.
Just because that's everything for
That's
them begins with
Pythonic.
underscores.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I don't want to happen, and I'm trying to prevent the pain that has not arrived yet. We go to ISO with what we have. It looks generic and good, gets approved. Then Python gets involved and says, "Oh, actually, we need you to change the spec." I want that to happen during the process, not after the process.
So I think there's a little bit of research about what the process north from here towards ISO looks like, because I think there is the potential here to involve the communities, not with there is a finished spec, but with there is a draft spec, and we would like your involvement to make sure that it actually fits you well.
Yep. So we can start that process. My question I'm posing here is, do we get involvement before starting that process, or do we start the process to get the involvement?
Pardon me. In my mind, there are a couple of unknown questions about what the process looks like northbound that are probably better addressed to people who have dealt with it in the SPDX community.
So there's SPDX and other things, a few other things have gone through the past fast track process, and that is very different. And this is why I'm holding back. The fast track process does not leave much room for the kind of draft working that I'm seeking. You take a spec that is done and you walk it through, and it gets approved because it looks like a good enough spec, and you are trusted to have done the work beforehand. And this is part of why SPDX has had so many revisions over time. That is, a challenge for tooling authors. I'm trying to avoid that particular path. ITF has no such fast track, for example.
My generic sense is, and I think we probably for time need to break off shortly after this, is I prefer the fast track path in the generic. I would like to do the review within the context of Omnibor itself, bringing in the tool communities to review, and then fast track from there. Does that make sense?
I think you and I should probably have a longer chat, maybe with, like you said, some folks who've gone through both of these to compare them. I can appreciate the value of the fast track. I also have concerns about its efficacy.
Sure. Okay.
Cool. So looks like we've got some steps now on the rename GitBOM to Omnibor.
Yeah, I tried to list out the things that occurred to me. Obviously, there's the website update, the spec updates, we'd mentioned Twitter accounts. It sounds like there's a Mastodon server. Oh, sorry, somebody already had Mastodon. It's apologies. Migrating or renaming the GitHub org. Are there other things that occur to folks about the tasks for naming updates?
Looks comprehensive as far as I know.
Yeah.
Until the known or unknown unknowns emerge. But yep. Yeah.
Donald Rumsfeld, for all his many sins, was underappreciated.
I know,
as a comedian.
it's such a good quote.
No. Yeah, I remember
so
watching.
useful.
It's like watching. At some points, those press conferences were like watching the world's darkest comedy.
Totally. That's why they got Steve Carell to play him in the movie with Christian Bale. Anyway, let's not go into politics. Yep.
Just added 4 more accounts.
Good
Cool.
point. We have a Skype account?
We have a Skype account?
Zoom, sorry,
Oh, you mean
Zoom.
Zoom.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I mean Zoom. It's like Kleenex.
Yeah. Oh, the YouTube is another good one. YouTube is another good one. The good news is that's fairly easy to do.
Okay. Thanks for indulging my rat holes today.
Cool.
Are there any tactical questions to address about how to go through the Omnibor update tasks? Who's going to do what when?
So tactically, many hands make light work. Some of these things like the website update are something of a heavy lift. The spec update, probably less so, just because I think mostly it's about renaming prefixes and things like that.
Yep.
Um,
Should we have a little spreadsheet, a checklist of who's on point for each one, and then just have a quick readout in each meeting of like, okay, what's the status, person status?
It is so wonderful to work with organized people.
You know, I'd say a Kanban board, but that might be too much.
Ooh, well, there are GitHub projects. I am super open to anyone who wants to bring organization to bear on any of this.
Okay. Yeah, we have what, seven or eight items here. I think we should assign an owner to each one and then just track that.
Yep.
I suppose I'm putting my hand up to do that organizational process work between now and the next meeting. I might miss next week's meeting. I'll be in DC for some stuff, but I should be back the week after that.
Cool.
Yeah, actually, I'm not going to be up at 5 a.m. in DC to join.
No.
Wait, it's not 5 a.m. in DC.
Why would you be at 5 a.m.?
Wait, sorry, no,
Oh.
11. I'm not going to be here at 11 because I'll be in a meeting at 11.
Oh, gotcha. Cool. So are you in
That is a
Hawaii?
less
Can-
Yeah, that is a less confusing assertion than the original assertion. Don't confuse. I'm confused enough about time zones. Please don't screw with my head.
Need more coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, cool. Well, that brings us about right to the end of time. Thank you so much for everyone joining, and thank you for the good conversation.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nell, for hosting today.
You bet. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.